Since the beginning of time, humans have risked life and limb to push back the boundaries of exploration.
Walk outside and look at an 8-level building, and that's how big the waves were. They were about 80 feet high.
If you're doing an expedition by yourself in the Arctic Ocean and you have frostbitten fingers and you try to continue, you'll end up dead.
Some doctors said to my face that I would never walk again and that I would never talk again.
Adventure and exploration is naturally fraught with risk and danger. But for many, it is simply the challenge that attracts them in the first place. As a relative of Scott of the Antarctic, I always admired the intrepid pioneers who pushed back the boundaries of adventure and exploration. And since 1985, I've been fortunate to be involved in a number of world record-breaking attempts of my own. The most dangerous was an attempt to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a hot air balloon in 1987, accompanied by balloon designer Lindstrom. My aim was to emulate Charles Lindbergh, who was the first to cross the Atlantic in an aeroplane 76 years ago.
We arranged a meeting in London and we met, and within half an hour we had agreed to make the attempt the next summer.
50 more yards to go!
Pritchard always been very much into breaking records and pushing the limits.
Challenger, the Bishop Rock Lighthouse. Congratulations.
We weren't the first to attempt crossing the Atlantic by balloon. Earlier flights ended in disaster.
The previous attempts were rather risky affairs. They were done with low budgets. A lot of them hadn't even flown a gas balloon before. They took great risks, and some of them paid the ultimate price. A record attempt of this caliber can never be made totally safe. You can make it safer, but you're never totally safe.
In our attempt to break the world record, we had to go back to the drawing board.
The transatlantic balloon was quite unique. It was the biggest balloon by a wide margin ever made. It had a unique skin, it had solar absorbent qualities, and of course you can't test fly something like that, but you're likely to destroy the envelope in the first landing. So you're taking a big risk when you're doing it.
We understand that the launch of the Virgin Atlantic Flyer, the hot air balloon, looks like it's a definite situation coming up, so stay tuned to the Rock of Maine.
Dawn, July the 2nd, 1987. We launched from the Carabasset Valley on the eastern coast of the United States. But as we take off, we encountered our first problem. We lost the fuel tank.
No one expects to lose a propane tank on takeoff, but we had 6 tanks. And I reckon we could have crossed the Atlantic on half the fuel we had, so we had a good margin.
Temperature inside the capsule is about 65 degrees. Now outside, we understand it is some 40 degrees below zero. They are just rocking their way across the ocean.
I don't know whether you're picking me up down there, but I wish you could all be up here enjoying it with us, because beginning of a great adventure.
We had successfully climbed to our cruising altitude of 27,000 feet. It was only then that it really hit home. The capsule would be our life support for the next 48 hours.
The transatlantic capsule was fairly cramped. There was just space for 2 people, no space to sleep. Quite convenient with the control, easy to operate all the valves and so on. But we only expected to be there for 2 days, so for 2 days you can live with it.
Our first challenge was to catch the jet stream towards Ireland. Nobody had ever flown in the jet stream before, and many people believed high winds would destroy the balloon, and that travelling at speeds of 150 to 200 miles an hour could be fatal. But it worked.
We did pick up some tremendous speed on that flight. For us to have 80 to 100 knots was quite unique, and that's why we flew so quickly.
31 hours later, and just 200 miles off the coast of Northern Ireland, the balloon developed a problem.
Is it steady or climbing?
Trapping excess heat.
And we're finding
great difficulty actually getting the balloon to go down. And obviously the danger of it, the solar heating working so well that we just go up to sort of 40 or 50,000 feet is something which is worrying us. We eventually managed to get some control of the balloon back, but then immediately we were faced with another problem: horrendous winds.
So the option was to land in Ireland. We had bad weather in Ireland, there was a cold front lying across Northern Ireland, but that was our only choice. I came in to land, and the balloon was almost uncontrollable in that kind of weather. And we bounced, lost the fuel tanks, and I realized that it's too dangerous. We would end up in the power line, or we would hit the house or something like that. And therefore the choice was to land in the water, which we had trained for, and it was perfectly safe to do so.
Although we had prepared ourselves for the option of landing in water, we were also relying on special explosive bolts to fire and separate the capsule from the balloon itself.
The landing in the sea would have been a perfect routine landing had the explosive bolts worked. It would have been a nice clean separation of the capsule will float happily, and we were quite safe inside it. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. We came in to land, and I was at the controls, and we hit the water, and I fired the explosive bolts. Nothing happened.
The failure of the bolts now put Per and I in grave danger.
You don't remain in the capsule after firing the explosive bolts, because if they have partly severed and the balloon now will go up 200 feet and then the capsule will separate, you're going to fall to your death, of course. I screamed at Pritchard in the water. So Pritchard went up the ladder, I went up after him, and the balloon was now going by 12 knots in the water, surfing along with the envelope still attached to it. So I just went up, took one step, and just dived over the side in the water. I expected Richard to follow me immediately in the water.
But just as I was about to follow Per and jump, the balloon started to shoot up again. I was holding on outside the capsule for dear life as the balloon soared to 15,000 feet. After nearly 2 days of crossing the Atlantic by balloon, our first attempt at breaking the record was in serious trouble. Forced to crash land in the Irish Sea, the explosive bolts that should have separated the balloon from the capsule had not fired. Our lives were now at risk.
My greatest concern was this capsule tumbling away from the balloon, because once activated and not functioning, you've got to get out there.
The next few minutes were amongst the loneliest of my life, standing on the edge of the balloon, my oxygen mask on, parachute on, trying to pluck up the courage to jump into the sea, scribbling a note to my family. Then suddenly I realized that the balloon above me was the biggest parachute that anyone could ever have. So I climbed back in and started flying it back towards the sea. By this time, Per had been in the sea for nearly 30 minutes.
Once in the water, I orientated myself and realized we were about 4 kilometers from the beach, which isn't too bad to swim. I'm a good swimmer. I started swimming and realized suddenly the tide is going out. The tide had exactly the same speed as I was swimming. I had 2 islands on my right, which I lined up. And now I started getting worried. I realized that it's only 12 degrees in the water. I keep swimming and swimming and make very little progress. One lifeboat from Port Leach passed me without looking at me. 2 helicopters went right over me, not looking. And I was about 1.5 kilometers from the beach. I started really getting tired, and I thought, it doesn't look very good.
As the balloon approached the sea, I climbed back on top of the capsule and got ready to jump downwind. As I hit the water, I had the most wonderful feeling of being alive, and as I surfaced, I saw a Navy helicopter right above me. When I asked about Per, I was shocked to find that he still hadn't been picked up.
But then he said suddenly, "What is Per?" "Oh," said the guy, "there were two of you in there."
After 2 hours in the freezing cold Irish Sea, the pair was located, and miraculously, he was still alive.
It was definitely the closest call I ever had. I don't think I would have lasted more than 10 minutes.
Well, despite crashing into the Irish Sea, we were still the first hot air balloonists to have ever crossed the Atlantic. Just.
Any doubt about a world record is gone. They touch the ground.
It says something, I think, about the undertaking that hasn't even been attempted since.
For British climber Paul Pritchard, the Australian island of Tasmania provided him with the toughest challenge he would ever face. He was one of the greatest climbers of his generation, and a prize-winning writer on his sport. In February 1998, Paul and his former girlfriend Celia Bull got the opportunity they'd always dreamt of, a chance to attempt Tasmania's infamous totem pole.
The most challenging thing about the totem pole is all these elemental forces come into play to stack the chances against you. It's like climbing a vertical side of a brick wall house for 60 metres. No world climbing tour would be complete without it. But it all went awry.
It was on Friday the 13th that Paul and Celia set out for the 8-kilometre walk to the awe-inspiring geographical feature. As is customary, they abseiled down to the bottom of the rock before making the dangerous climb back up.
I probably made about 3 moves up on the rope. I swung off the rock. And then everything went black.
A small boulder had fallen 30 metres from the peak of the totem pole and struck Paul's head.
I lost consciousness without really knowing what was going on. And the next thing that I noticed was that I was upside down and blood was pouring into the sea. The sea was probably only a metre below my head, and the tide was coming in.
This serious head injury rendered Paul completely helpless. Without a boat below, Celia had to try to get him back up to the top on her own.
I think Celia explained to me what had happened and that some rocks had fallen off, but I didn't really understand it. She then climbed back up the rope to the halfway ledge and then commenced this mammoth effort of hauling me back up to the ledge. I remember her shouting, "You got to help me, you got to help me if we're going to get you out of this." So I tried to help her, and that's when I realised that my right side wasn't working.
Somehow, Celia managed to haul Paul to the halfway ledge and secured him to the rock. She then ran the 8 kilometres to the nearest telephone for help. Unable to move and critically ill, Paul lay waiting alone and frightened on the ledge.
I remember putting my hand under my helmet and feeling this huge hole in my skull. And when I pulled my hand away, I mean all this clear fluid on my hand. And I think at that point I did actually think, this is it, I'm going to die.
Meanwhile, the emergency services and the rescue team were on their way.
Initial information indicated a climber injured on the candlestick, in fact, which is another rock structure right beside the totem pole. At that point, we didn't have too many other details.
As they reached the rock, paramedic Neil Smith quickly assessed the severity of Paul's situation.
The ledge we were on was probably 2 metres long by 1 metre wide. Basically, it had quite a pool of blood on it, covering most of that ledge. Paul was unconscious, and there were some body movements, but they were in no coordinated sort of manner.
The The only way to get Paul off the rock was by using a rescue vessel in the sea below, a dangerous procedure.
I was tied to him and he was just kind of abseiling down to a boat, a waiting boat with me.
Getting into the boat wasn't quite as easy as we hoped. The boat had to come in and out a couple of times with it just rocking with a swell. And on the third time that it came in, I managed to grab that with my legs and physically pull it towards me. And once we were low enough into the boat, I just got the policeman in the boat to cut the ropes.
10 hours after the accident, Paul and Celia were raced to the nearest hospital. Waiting for him was a nurse who was to play a significant role in his future.
I remember coming on early shift and night staff had come in and said there'd been a horrible rock climbing accident down on the Tasman Peninsula, and I kind of panicked a bit because I know a lot of the rock climbing community here. I remember going to the computer and saw the name P. Pritchard, which I didn't recognise at all, and I kind of was quite relieved that I didn't know them.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir? Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Paul needed to have bone fragments removed from his brain and a partial skull reconstruction.
I don't think that I realised how serious my injury was until I'd come out of intensive care about 4 days later. And I realised that my right arm and right leg were like wooden poles. There's no life in them at all. And all I could do was break down in tears all the time.
Paul had not only lost the use of the right side of his body, but he'd also lost his ability to communicate normally.
I had to learn how to talk again. That was a really frustrating part of it, really, for me.
Even though he was unable to speak, he still made an impression on Jane.
It was hard because he couldn't really say much. When I first met him, he was like kind of super polite, I guess, and I guess very reserved type, I think, because he was still pretty much in shock himself with what had happened.
Some doctors here said to my face that I would never walk again and that I would never talk again, which was really, really cruel, in fact, because with a head injury, you never know. You never know what's going to happen.
Paul spent a further month in Hobart before being airlifted back to the UK to begin the long process of recovery. By now, his condition was putting a tremendous strain on his relationship with Celia.
We split up as a couple, which, I'm not saying that. Anyway, we're not together anymore.
Did you roll the ball away with me?
I think I'm
Come over to me.
luckily a very positive person.
Roll the ball.
I think that's what really got me through this, because it was quite a long time, It's like I was 9 months in rehab. It would be the same thing day in, day out. Speech therapy, physiotherapy, just learning how to dress yourself and shower yourself, and it was really, I can't describe it.
Happily, Paul not only regained his power of speech, but was eventually able to walk again. And such was his strength of character, a year later in 1999, he decided to return to the rock that almost defeated him.
I think as a writer, returning to the totem pole was actually really important for me, because I realised that I had such an amazing story to write, and I realised that the only conclusion would be returning to it.
As he watched a climber on the totem pole, Paul recorded his thoughts for a new book.
I have like a silent feeling, like a memory. And I also have these adrenaline surges that keep kind of hitting me like a sledgehammer or something. And to see him climbing there, I guess I just wish that I'd have climbed it.
While in Tasmania, Paul decided to look up a nurse that had played a vital role in his recovery, Jane.
I took some time off work to take him sightseeing around the state, and we just hit it off like massively.
And realised kind of that we loved each other, I guess, yeah.
So it was pretty quick, I guess, yeah.
Paul and Jane are now not only happily married and living in Tasmania, but they now have a child, Caddy.
I never really thought that I would want a child up until having this accident, and now it seems really quite important for me to have a family. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's something to do with continuing the genes and having, you know, making yourself immortal. I'm not sure.
Paul was able to put the incident behind him, but not all victims of trauma are so lucky.
I'm certainly much more aware these days of what the sea can do. It's just nightmares that come back to you all the time.
There are few challenges as exciting and unpredictable as offshore yacht racing. Offshore racing is one of the most dangerous sports on the planet. At the absolute mercy of sea conditions, your boat becomes your whole world, and your crew becomes your most important lifeline. Sydney, the centre of Australia's sailing community and departure point for the sport's most prestigious prize. The Sydney to Hobart race annually represents one of sailing's toughest challenges. In December 1998, the annual competition for Rob Matthews and his crew was to become a race for survival.
The start of the Hobart race is on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day, and it's really something you have to see to believe. It's enormous. There's literally hundreds of thousands of people around Sydney Harbour. There are thousands of spectator boats out there to follow the fleet out through the heads and into the open ocean. The atmosphere is electric.
However, in 1998, the carnival atmosphere didn't last very long.
It became apparent to me very early in the afternoon, only a matter of hours after the start of the race, that something big was going to happen the next day, something unprecedented.
For Rob Matthews and the crew of his boat, the Business Post Naya, the race to the finish became a race for survival.
During the afternoon, the weather deteriorated fairly rapidly and the seas built enormously very quickly. They got to the stage where I'd never seen seas like it before. There was no panic at all amongst the crew. We'd been through what we thought were conditions like that before, and we were confident of the boat, we were confident of the crew.
But they were unaware of the intensity of the storm building around them.
We knew that we were in very severe conditions by late afternoon.
The conditions you just had to see to believe. The best way to describe them to the man in the street is walk outside and look at an 8-level building. And that's how big the waves were. They were about 80 feet high.
Initially, as the seas grew bigger, the crew were able to ride out the worst waves confronting them.
We'd been in breaking waves for 5 or 6 hours, and they'd been getting more severe, but nothing had looked like it was going to do anything apart from break over the boat.
However, the Naya was suddenly thrown into turmoil.
The rain and the spume that was being blown off the water was hitting your face like needles, like driving nails into your eyes. We could hear a wave coming, but you couldn't see it in the dark. I remember it happened that quickly that I couldn't steer the boat up into the wave. It just smashed into a side-on, lifted us up, bang on the roof.
A giant wave took the Naiad completely by surprise and capsized the boat, trapping Rob and the crew underneath.
I was under the water and I was running out of breath. I may have only been there 15 or 20 seconds and I realised it wasn't going to come up. After I'd been under there and nearly out of breath, I picked my head up and stuck my nose right up in the cockpit just as a wave lifted us. I got my nose up in a little pocket of air, took a big snortful of air, and the boat went under again. That pocket of air absolutely saved my life.
Rob managed to unclip himself and swim under the boat. He desperately tried to look for Phil.
I was yelling out for Phil. The wind and spume and the noise out there made it nearly impossible for anybody to hear anything anyway. But he never came to the surface.
After what seemed like an eternity, the boat eventually righted itself and they found the body of Phil Skeggs.
We managed to roll Phil over onto his back. We felt for a pulse in his neck and his wrists. It was just that violent that we couldn't really tell whether there was a pulse.
The yachts in the Sydney to Hobart race were in serious trouble. They'd run into one of the worst storms ever seen in the Tasman Sea. As dawn broke, Rob became concerned about the whereabouts of the skipper, Bruce Guys.
Matthew, Sheriff and myself were out on deck hoping for any sight of a ship or a plane, some form of rescue. And I said to Matthew, haven't seen Bruce around, and he said, didn't you know, Bruce died last night.
2 members of the Naiad crew had now perished. 7 were still alive. The boat was completely disabled. All they could do was pray to be rescued.
A fixed-wing aircraft flew by about 2 or 3 miles away. So straight away, Matthew fired off a parachute flare and the plane flew on. We didn't think they'd seen us.
But the stricken yacht had been spotted. The Care Flight rescue helicopter was now on their way to the Naiad's location.
When we first came over the Naiad, the weather conditions out there were just atrocious. I'd never seen seas like this.
We knew we had no communications with the vessel at all, so then it was a matter of spending some time for ourselves to come up with a game plan to go ahead to provide the assistance. And by doing that, we knew that we needed to get somebody on board.
I looked up and there was a guy leaning out the door and he was pointing at me and pointing at the water.
He looked to the left and he looked to the right and he thought, well, you mean me?
I wasn't going to leave the boat without some chance of getting back to it because the conditions were still horrendous. And I jumped off the stern of the boat, swam out about probably 30 feet, and the frogman, who I now know as Murray Trainer, came down on the wire and he landed probably about 4 feet in front of me. The next second it's like we were being bungee jumped backwards. We were just absolutely reefed out of the water.
It was vital for the rescue team to get as much information from Rob as possible.
We were told basically that there were 7 survivors, all had minor injuries only, and that the other 2, one man below decks and the other man lashed to the deck, those 2 were dead. Now, it may have sounded silly to the survivor, but I quizzed him pretty closely to make sure that he knew that these people were dead. I didn't want to get back to shore with 7 survivors and then suddenly have someone express doubt about whether the 2 people we'd left on the boat were in fact dead or not.
There were still 6 more crew members on the Naiad to be rescued. Time was running out.
I heard them say over the intercom that they'd only be able to get 4 because they were running low on fuel. And I can remember getting quite vocal at that stage and saying, "You're not going to leave any of these blokes. You're going to have to try and get them all." And I heard the pilot say that they'd try and get them all.
I did not anticipate that we would winch all 7 on board the aircraft in that one sortie.
I was able to hear the conversations going on between the 3 of them. It seemed to me that the winch man was almost the guy in charge of the helicopter. He was yelling out, "Forward 2 feet, right 2 feet, left 3 feet." He's also keeping an eye on the waves. They were so fast at getting the guys to jump off the boat, and Murray on the end of the wire was just gathering them up and picking them up and herding us into the helicopter just so quickly.
The care flight team remarkably took a total of 20 minutes to evacuate the crew of the stricken yacht to safety. A truly amazing feat in such treacherous conditions.
To know that you've been able to assist somebody in a situation and knowing that those guys are on their way back to Tasmania to meet up with their families, very satisfying situation. I don't think anything could be any more sort of satisfying than that.
115 yachts started the race, but only 44 finished. Sadly, 6 sailors lost their lives in the freak storm.
However, this death toll could have been much higher were it not for the extraordinary efforts of the rescue crews.
I'm certainly much more aware these days of what the sea can do. I'm certainly a much more emotional person these days. And I do, even big storms at home, I find that I can't sleep all that well. It's just nightmares that come back to you all the time.
Historically, the Arctic Circle has been the graveyard of polar expeditions. As one of the most extreme environments on our planet, temperatures at the North Pole can often plunge to -50 degrees. In February 2000, one of the world's great explorers, Ranulph Fiennes, attempted to become the first person in history to walk solo to the North Pole.
I don't normally like to do an expedition by myself. In those regions, polar regions, north or south, I normally prefer to have at least one other colleague with me, because in the north there's a possibility of falling into the water and being unable to get yourself up the ice banks back onto the top.
Despite the dangers of a solo expedition, Fiennes was keen to attempt this challenge.
If you do fall into the water, you have only got yourself to get yourself out of the problem.
No solo unsupported human has ever made it to the pole by the direct route, which is the difficult route. So it hasn't been done before. Lots and lots of polar trips are done the whole time, like Mount Everest, but not by this route, not this way, which is the ultimate, the most difficult way.
He would face a 700-mile trek in his bid to reach the North Pole, in conditions cold enough to freeze the fluid in his eyes. Fiennes had to train hard. He'd have to pull his 2,000-pound sledges up sheer ridges whilst trying to avoid cracks in the ice shelf to the freezing sea below. All this in a region roamed by polar bears.
I've not done an expedition up here before without somebody else. The polar bears only attack the back person. If there are 9 of you, they go for the 9th person. And I, as leader, I always made sure that I wasn't the back person, and therefore they would go for one of the others. On this occasion, obviously, there isn't a back person, so there's a feeling on the hairs on your back of your neck sometimes when you think you hear noises, or just after you've seen big prints.
Expecting problems with the treacherous ice floes, Fiennes decided upon an unconventional plan.
I decided I'd set out about a month earlier in the darkness, when you don't have sun all day, But of course you do have moonlight for 2 weeks and then not for the next 2 weeks. So I thought that by doing this, I would be able to, although it would be extremely cold and dark to begin with, it would get me out a long way towards the pole by the time the ice deteriorated badly.
The Arctic Circle stays dark for 182 days a year. Fiennes believed that setting off before the Arctic Spring would ensure the ice he was travelling over would stay firm. But he didn't account for the actions of the moon.
Because the full moon has an effect on the sea, and when the sea surged, all the ice floes on top of it cracked. And so there was a lot more sea all around in the dark and a lot of noise of tons of breaking ice. I ended up in an unhealthy situation.
With the ice cracking around him, Fiennes became trapped on a narrow ridge.
The sledge behind me slipped off the apex down over the broken blocks, and with 300 pounds pulling downwards, I slipped and came off the ridge and started falling down into the sea.
To stop himself being dragged into the water and slipping under the ice, he had to detach himself from his sinking sledge. However, the sledge contained his essential survival kit.
I had no alternative but to try and find where it was snagged under the ice. So on my stomach, I sort of eeled down, rather like someone fishing for tadpoles in a pond, and put my hand down under the ice to try and find where it was snagged, to pull it.
He plunged his left hand into the icy water. His wet fingers were then exposed to the brutal -50-degree air. Although he had successfully retrieved his sledge, he now faced an even more serious problem.
If you're doing an expedition by yourself in the Arctic Ocean and you have frostbitten fingers and you try to continue, you'll end up dead.
He knew that his frostbitten hand needed urgent medical attention. And 2 weeks into the expedition, in the middle of the Arctic Circle, he had to find a way back.
I knew there was a place called Ward Hunt Island. There wasn't actually anybody there, but there was a hut which had been lived in by an expedition that I had led 10 years or 15 years previously. So I knew exactly where it was, or I thought I did.
After 24 hours, Fiennes made it to the hut and was able to radio for help. 2 days later, he was airlifted back to Canada. Although he was leaving the immediate danger of the Arctic Circle, the accident had a long-lasting effect.
Within 3 days of the accident, I was in a hospital, and they said, well, they'd have to amputate a certain amount. And so they peeled off all the blistered skin. I forget the word they used, but that was not a pleasant experience. And so you've got 1 inch to 1.5 inches of red, gnarled, mummified finger sticking out, which puts people off, children scream.
It can take months for the true extent of frostbite to reveal itself. Once tissue has died, it rarely regenerates. But where living tissue meets dead tissue, some of the cells can start to regrow. Fiennes was told he would have to wait 5 months before they could finally tidy up the ends of his fingers.
Well, about 1 month into this waiting period, I was getting extremely irritable and unpleasant because in everyday life, you just can't not hit things with fingers. And every time the ends of one of these dead fingers knocked against something, even slightly, one's language became extremely bad.
The pain became so unbearable he decided to take matters into his own hands. With no anaesthetic or surgical tools, he set about amputating his frostbitten fingers in his garden shed.
To do this with 2 different operations, at a cost of about £6,000 uncovered by the insurance, wasn't a very good idea when you could do it yourself. So common sense dictated that I could do it myself.
Fiennes' first surgical procedure on his own frostbitten hand was luckily a success, and 4 months later, proper surgeons tied it up the end of his fingers.
That's a standard thumb. That's the one I cut off, so there's probably about an inch missing. I don't want to be conceited, but I think a pretty good job. Didn't cost anything at all, and the result was a great improvement over the next 4 months waiting for the operation.
Fiennes made a full recovery from the accident. His solo attempt to reach the North Pole remained unchallenged until the 19th of May 2003, when fellow British explorer Pen Hadow achieved Fiennes' goal. Challenges like an Arctic crossing require the most intricate planning. However, even the best laid plans cannot account for freak occurrences.
Just as we were letting go of the plane to commence the skydive, the reserve parachute came whizzing past my head.
In 1986, I decided to undertake my first skydive as part of my preparations for crossing the Atlantic by balloon. Fortunately, I had two very experienced skydivers with me. I pulled the wrong ripcord and I lost the main parachute. But luckily, my fast-thinking instructor caught up with me and pulled the cord on my reserve chute. The accident was a sharp reminder. Skydiving is a very dangerous sport. One small mistake can lead to disaster. In April 2001, a group of experienced Australian skydivers were training for a competition later in the year.
The team was preparing for the national championships that were being held in December of that year.
I was actually filling in for that weekend for their normal cameraman. He had something else on.
It was their 9th training jump of the day. I think it was about my 11th flight of the day, so just about on every flight of the day. It was a beautiful day, blue sky, perfect day for skydiving.
As the pilot, Barry would normally have little reason to wear a parachute.
My partner Dawn made me wear the parachute that day. I would wear it one day and then not one day, but she made me stick it on that day.
At 14,000 feet, the skydivers prepared for their jump.
As we were climbing out for that jump, everyone set themselves in position, and just as we were letting go of the plane to commence the skydive, the reserve parachute came whizzing past my head.
One of the skydivers' reserve parachutes had accidentally opened as he got ready to jump. He was dragged out of the plane, and the force of the wind wrapped the reserve chute and the skydiver around the tail of the plane, putting enormous pressure on the aircraft.
About 2-ton pull force on the end of the tailplane. After 11 seconds fighting with the plane like that, in that condition, the tail actually separated.
As the rest of the divers jumped out, Simon's camera continued to capture the unfolding events. Eventually, the tail separated from the plane, with the skydiver still attached.
As it was nose diving towards the ground, that as I'm free falling behind it, hoping that, wishing that Barry get out of the plane, get out of the plane.
How I reacted was to try and get everyone out before it lost it completely. I just started screaming at them as hard as I could to get out.
Once sure that all the skydivers had exited the plane, Barry made his move.
So I shut the plane down, shut the engine down, turned the fuel off, gave a mayday call, and then proceeded to exit the plane.
However, once Barry relinquished the controls, the plane went into a deadly spin.
It just wound up and I just got pushed straight to the floor. My foot got caught around the seat belts. I couldn't quite get my foot out. I had to slip a boot off.
You can see the ground getting closer and realising that there's not a whole lot of time left. And it's like, come on, come on, come on.
I thought I was going to die. I couldn't get the door open. It was jamming against itself. The plane was picking up speed. It was really starting to accelerate towards the ground. I could get a glimpse of the horizon. I knew I was getting down to about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And I knew that if I didn't get that door open really quickly, that it was going to be curtains. The thought of not seeing my daughter again just made me somehow strength come over me, and I just got the door open and I knew I had to get out.
At the last possible second, Barry managed to jump out of the doomed aircraft and deploy his parachute.
It was a matter of 2 or 3 seconds that I saw Barry's parachute open until the plane impacted with the ground.
Once back on the ground, Simon, with camera still rolling, ran to Barry's aid.
I just got out! The door was shut! I couldn't get the door open! Oh, fast.
When I look back on it now, I think I'm extremely lucky. I was just able to get that door open and get out just in the nick of time.
Sadly, the skydiver wrapped around the tail of the plane died when the aircraft hit the ground. The team has not jumped together since.
I felt heartbroken. To lose a good friend like that, it's a hard thing for anyone to go through. But we had to dig deep into our hearts and go, well, at least he died doing something that he did enjoy doing.
Without Dawson's brave efforts, there would have been many more victims.
I think I'm a little bit more appreciative of life. Family means a lot to me. Now I think I respect a lot more the people that are really close to you. When you think you're about to die, that's what you're thinking of. You're not thinking about paying your phone bill.
The 20th century has a rich history of exploration and adventure, and I feel proud to be part of that tradition.
It was the 54th race, and there'd never been a drama in the previous 53 races. But the Hobart race is on the way back again. It's a great race, it's a classic, and it will continue to grow, and it'll continue to go from strength to strength.
He himself would want us to go on skydiving as well, doing what he loved as well.
Engineering has always been progressed by record attempts, people taking things to the limits. And that is why we're having jet airplanes today, that's why we have high-speed trains and so on. You've got to try the limits and make it go faster and better.
But will the 21st century see the same desire to push the boundaries even further, despite the dangers? I certainly hope so.